You are listening to Reality Hurts, Episode 1. Today is May 11th, 2018, and we are recording in HSPVA. Domestic abuse has a long and dark history in our society, and in more recent years it has been on the rise. According to Houston Public Media, there are 214,000 domestic abuse cases in Texas in 2016, a definite increase from the 193,000 cases in 2011. In a Houston article poll on the matter done in 2016, 1 in 5 women in Utah have experienced domestic violence. Domestic abuse is on the rise, and we need to find a way to stop it. We recognize that a husband who batters his wife today may be a murderer tomorrow, said the captain of the Houston Police Department. A good example of this was the unfortunate Sutherland Springs shooting that happened late last year. The shooter, Devin Patrick Kelly, had a history of domestic violence and had previously assaulted his wife and son. On the podcast today, we will be going more in depth on the topic.
In order to get some insight on how domestic abuse affects people's lives, we will be talking to a woman that has witnessed domestic abuse in her childhood. Interviewing her will be Eva Trackman. We thank her so much for choosing to share such an emotional and personal part of her past with us.
When your family was affected by domestic violence?
So I think that everybody in my family, immediate family, was affected by domestic violence. My mother, especially my mother and my oldest 2 siblings. And then by default, I think the younger 2 siblings, which was, one of them was me, just by witnessing a lot of the things that happened, were affected by domestic violence.
Speaking of being affected by domestic violence, there are many daily activities, and how could they have been affected by the knowledge of what happens inside the house that no one knows about?
Well, for me, I think the most significant incidences that happened, they weren't directed towards me, but my sister was once hurt very badly, and my mother, when I was around 7 or 8, was hurt very badly. And I think the shame that came with that, of knowing that your family was being talked about and that people were discussing it and worrying about their safety, and also just being scared of my father. And at one point, my brother was also violent towards my sisters, so just being afraid of them on a daily basis was part of my childhood, but it got better later on.
How did friends and family tend to react when learning this information?
With the incidences when I was around 11 or 12, we had moved to the U.S. and my brother had been in a rampage. He really severely beat up my older sister, and it was really scary because she could not even move her neck. It was really bad. I remember telling my best friend at the time, who came from such a functional home. She had a mom and dad, and they never had incidences like this. I think it was a little overwhelming for her at the time for me to explain all these things, and I think she was really worried for me. And her family, they would always invite me over to spend the night or spend some time there, and they became rock solid foundation for me in my middle school and high school years. So I had that benefit of my best friend, who I'm still best friends with now, to be that solid support for me. But family, it was mixed. Some family it's strange because when you've got a sibling who does this to another sibling, the parents don't know how to feel. There was a lot of dysfunction there, and we had to go to a lot of therapy and figure things out.
I got that your friend really helped to support. Was she the one that helped most in dealing with emotional consequences?
No, because at the end of the day, she had no idea really how to handle it. She was just as young as I was. So I think the best way for us to handle it was to talk about it with my oldest 2 sisters, the one who was deeply affected by it, and my older sister. We had a lot of discussions about it, and then ultimately when I went to college and as a young college graduate, I went to therapy and handled it that way. So a lot of years of psychotherapy helped me out.
Were there moments where you felt like the domestic abuse would keep going on forever?
When we were living in the Cayman Islands from the age of 4 to the age of 8, and then after that, when we moved to the U.S., it had stopped by then, but the worst time was when we were living in the Cayman Islands. It was kind of all I ever knew, so maybe there was a part of me that thought it was normal, but maybe I thought it would go on forever at the time, because I was so young.
And seeing other people, you obviously felt like there was something strange going on because they don't experience it.
Yes, there was a lot going on even outside of the domestic abuse. My mother was a little mentally ill at the time. She was having a nervous breakdown. I think it was prompted by my father once hurting her. After that, within the community and the island, the Pakistani community, there was a lot of shame that I felt as a family, just kind of exposing all of our issues to everybody else. It was a very small island, small community, everyone talked.
When you felt like the domestic abuse would keep going on forever, did you have any possible positive thoughts that helped you to get through it?
Again, I was very young, so I was 4, 5, 6, 7. The only positive person in my life at the time was my sister.
It's good when it's family because they understand more. What is your relationship now with the members of your family?
The people who were involved were, my father was the one who was violent at times. I have some reservations saying he was a completely violent man because there was a back and forth and there were times where he wouldn't do it, and my mother wasn't the perfect woman either, and so there's a lot of hesitation I have there, calling him a completely violent person, but my relationship with him is really good. Now, he's in his 70s and he hasn't been physically abusive for 25 years. I think moving to the United States really changed him. I think age kind of mellowed him out. So my relationship with him is really good. Ironically enough, my relationship with my mother isn't very good. And that's because, I empathize with her situation. She was in such a rough situation for such a long time. But you know when you kind of have higher expectations for the person who is more stable, or maybe your mother in general, you just have higher expectations. I think that was where I still have issues with that.
I remember you mentioning going to therapy. What exactly do they do there?
So when I started going to therapy, it was when I was in college, because at the University of Texas and at a lot of universities, they offer part of your tuition is paying for these services, counseling services. So I took advantage of it, and because you'd get free counseling. And my 2 older sisters had gone to therapy. My mother had gone to therapy. Basically, all the women in my family at that point had started going to therapy. And so I thought it would be a good idea for me to just work through my issues because I knew I had them. And so I started at that point. And it wasn't like I started talking about it right away. I think the issues that happen when you witness abuse are different for different people. And I think it came out for me in terms of my inability at the time to just trust men. And so I worked through some of the issues that would come up with that, but I also, through talking about it with friends and in therapy, I was able to kind of vent my concerns and really get some feedback. And then having a relationship with a man for the first time in college and then after college made me more aware of what my issues were. And it wasn't like I dealt with the physical trauma of receiving the blows, but witnessing it, I think, made me a very cautious person. And in some ways, I think it helped me choose my husband.
It's really interesting because I read of situations where people that experienced or witnessed domestic abuse in their past went on to relive the cycle. It's amazing that he didn't.
Yeah, and I give the credit to my mother for that because she broke the cycle. She really did, and many issues as we may have, she was the one who broke the issue, and she was the one who said everyone must go to therapy, and she was the one who wanted to move to the US because she knew that it would be harder for a man to beat a woman and get away with it in the US. I give her all the credit for that.
Why is it now that you feel open talking about your past?
I think, I'm in my 30s and I have a daughter and I'm a teacher, and these things, I feel like there's a lot of shame and there's a lot of unnecessary shame and all of this that I think is silly. And I think that talking about these kinds of things and exposing people to the problems that might happen when you're exposed to violence is going to bring awareness and maybe some empathy, and I'm happy about that.
conclusion, domestic abuse comes in all different shapes and sizes. It can gnaw at the core of your family, it can follow through your childhood all the way to adulthood in the form of anxiety and depression. Because domestic abuse can be experienced in so many different ways, it's hard to recognize when it is happening to those around you, which is why the warning signs, which can be found on the National Domestic Violence Hotline, should be utilized immediately.
Even if you can somehow recognize that someone is going through domestic abuse, there are limited ways to help them. Going through the police may result in more dangerous situations, as well as the abuser's methods can be proven to be fluid. If you see that someone is going through domestic abuse, let them know that you're there for them. Support them through their tough times, and keep an eye on their daily life and changes in behavior. If you feel like the situation is escalating and still don't know what to do, make sure to call the hotline.
The domestic hotline number is 1-800-799-SAFE or 7233. This has been Jacqueline Poiseau, Gabriel Barron, Alan Crabb, and Ethan Trackman on May 11th, 2018 in Houston, Texas. Thank you for listening to Domestic Abuse Awareness Episode 1 for Reality Hurts.